It's become very popular to say that the Gospels were written and originally distributed anonymously. Today we're going to look at some of their arguments, and I'm going to tell you why they don't work. Let's get into it. I want to make some preliminary remarks to frame the discussion. The first thing I want to do is make a distinction between internal anonymity and external anonymity. No one disputes that the Gospels are internally anonymous, meaning that the authors do not identify themselves within the text. You're never going to see Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John say, "Hi, my name is blank," and then identify themselves this way. But what doesn't follow from this is that we don't know who wrote the Gospels. In order to make such an assertion, you would have to say that the only way to know that someone wrote something is for them to internally identify themselves. This is obviously false. People could have their works attributed to them by others, they could have written under a pseudonym, or they could put their name on the cover of a book, or in the case of the Gospels, on the outside of the scroll. The reason this distinction is so important is because some people want to write off the entire debate right there. They want to say, hold on, Mark never says I'm Mark, or John doesn't say I'm John, and so therefore the Gospels are anonymous, end of discussion. Well, we can see that it doesn't actually follow that just because they don't internally identify themselves, that they are in fact anonymous in the sense that no one knows who wrote them. Paul's letters can serve as a great test case for how disingenuous this objection feels to us Christians. We have many letters that are internally attributed to Paul, and skeptics still question his authorship. So we should stop pretending that if the authors' names were within the documents themselves, that people would gladly accept it to be true. Also, it was very common at the time the Gospels were written for authors to be omitted from within the work. True Histories, written by Lucian of Samosata, was also internally anonymous. So was Plato's The Republic and Plutarch's Parallel Lives. So how do we know who wrote those works? Their authorship is widely attested to externally, because human testimony is one of the main avenues through which we learn about historical events. Augustine makes a salient point here in his letter against Faustus. He's speaking about forged writings of Hippocrates, and he says this: "They were not recognized at his time, which his authorship of his genuine productions was ascertained." Those books, again, from a comparison with which the productions of questionable origin were rejected, are with certainty attributed to Hippocrates, and anyone who denies their authorship is answered only by ridicule, simply because there is a succession of testimonies to the books from the time of Hippocrates to the present day, which makes it unreasonable either now or hereafter to have any doubt on the subject. How do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? So, we've begun by drawing a very important distinction between internal and external anonymity. I am not trying to say today that the gospel authors identify themselves within the text, but what doesn't follow from that is that we do not know who wrote the gospels. In fact, the way that we learn about who wrote the gospels is the same way we learn about who wrote the Republic, or True Histories, or Parallel Lives. It's through a succession of testimony from those who receive their works. So for the skeptic to reject traditional authorship of the Gospels, they're going to have to give us good reasons to reject their testimony. This provides an opportunity to speak on the nature of testimony. The way that we approach testimony within our ordinary lives is that we trust it unless we have good reasons not to. Whenever you read the ingredients list on your food, for example, you trust that the ingredients are correct, because you believe that people who were in a position to know that specific information are reporting it to you accurately. You don't go home, get out a chemistry kit, and do a forensic analysis of all the ingredients to make sure they're correct. Or when you go to the gas station, you trust that the 87 unleaded button does in fact have 87 grade gasoline that is unleaded. It could be diesel, but you trust the testimony. One last example could be when you order something on Amazon. You trust that when the package arrives at your house, you will get exactly what you ordered. In other words, we treat testimony as innocent until proven guilty, and not guilty until proven innocent. This will be incredibly important moving forward, because many people begin with a hyper-skepticism toward any claim regarding the gospel. It is important to point out this double standard before proceeding. And to be clear, I am not saying that we should trust all testimony all the time. Of course, people lie or are mistaken. But the thing is, if we do not have good reasons to reject testimony, we should accept it. And this is how we operate within our ordinary lives, as we've already given examples of. And I can already hear the comments now. But Nathan, of course we're skeptical about the Gospels. They're religious texts, and they contain miracles. That means your claims about them require much more evidence. It's really important to remember that what we're talking about here is not an extraordinary claim. We're talking about 4 books that were written within the 1st century, and we're trying to figure out who wrote them. Just because there are miraculous claims within the Gospels doesn't mean that every claim regarding the Gospels is a supernatural claim. This would be a classic example of the fallacy of composition. This is simply not going to work. We're going to have to actually look at the evidence for the authorship and see where it leads us. So to summarize our preliminary remarks before we get into our arguments, I know that the Gospels are internally anonymous. I'm not contesting this, but what I am contesting is the idea that we have no idea who wrote the Gospels. Second, we should trust testimony absent defeaters. In other words, if we do not have good reason to doubt testimony, we should accept it. And finally, the authorship of the Gospels is a perfectly ordinary event. It isn't supernatural in nature, meaning that it requires no more evidence than any other ordinary claim. So, with all of that out of the way, now let's look at some of the arguments for why people think the Gospels are anonymous, and I'm going to tell you why they don't work. The first argument is going to be that the earliest document that mentions all 4 names of our authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, was Irenaeus and his work Against Heresies, written around 185 AD. So the basic claim is that Irenaeus was doing apologetics, he was dealing with heretics, and he arbitrarily added these 4 names because he was trying to get legitimacy added behind the Gospels. And so Matthew and John, they're apostles, Mark is a follower of Peter, and Luke is a follower of Paul, and so they think that this legitimizes the Gospels in some way for him adding these names, even though most people at this time, according to them, would have been dealing with anonymous documents. But this is an argument from silence, and arguments from silence are generally regarded as fallacious. Timothy McGrew writes, "There are indefinitely many reasons that an honest and well-informed writer might omit to mention some fact that, from our perspective, would have been most natural for him to include. And unless we are justified in ruling out all, we are not in a position to rest significant weight on the omission. Many historians fail to mention people or events that surprise us in hindsight, so it's safe to say that our intuitions regarding what a person from history would or would not mention aren't all that trustworthy. It's better to see what the reasons for believing one side or the other can provide, rather than relying on silence for your case." It's also important to note that even though Irenaeus is the first person to mention all 4 names, he is not the first to mention the authors per se. Papias mentions Matthew and Mark, for example. Justin Martyr betrays knowledge of the authors in his writings, and his follower Tatian wrote the Diatessaron, which is a harmonization of our 4 Gospels. It would be very weird if Justin Martyr didn't know the 4 authors of the Gospels, yet they were still regarded as authoritative by his pupil. This leads to an important distinction. An author does not need to mention all 4 Gospels in order to have information about who wrote them. What doesn't follow from this is that everyone before Irenaeus did not know who wrote the Gospels. This should seem fairly obvious. You can know something and not mention it. This argument simply is not going to work. The second argument for the anonymous gospel hypothesis is that early Christian writers quote the Gospels without citing their names. And here's an example from Didache chapter 8 verse 2. It says, "And do not pray as the hypocrites, but as the Lord commanded in his Gospel." And then he quotes Matthew chapter 6. You can find similar statements in Didache 11:13 and 15:4. 1 Clement 13 says, "Do judgment and righteousness most of all, remembering the words of the Lord Jesus when he spake, teaching forbearance and long-suffering, for thus he spoke." And then he quotes either Luke 6 or Matthew 7. Other examples like this can be found in Ignatius's letters, Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, and Justin Martyr's writings. The problem with this is that there's a major difference between citing a source without naming the author and treating a document as anonymous. All these examples show is that early Christian writers would quote the Gospels without citing their names. It does not show that they are treating them as anonymous documents. These are different things. Irenaeus himself, in Against Heresies, quotes from the Gospels in certain places, does not cite the author's name, and only attributes the sayings to the Lord. Since Irenaeus clearly names all 4 gospel authors within this work in some places and quotes them without citing them in others, we can see that this is a genuine distinction. There's also the Epistle to the Hebrews. The early church does treat this letter as anonymous, and they speculate about who wrote it. There are no such debates within the early church regarding the authorship of the Gospels. This point should be fairly straightforward, and we see examples of this in early church writers. Early Christians can quote a source without citing the name, without treating it as an anonymous document. The next argument in favor of anonymous gospel authorship is known as the synoptic problem. And what I mean by the synoptic problem is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke share lots of similar details, stories, and narratives, often in word-for-word correspondence. This is typically leveled against Matthew's authorship because if Matthew was an eyewitness, they say, why would he copy someone else's work? Couldn't he write down his own details of Jesus' ministry? It's very important to note that the Gospels are within the genre of ancient biography. There is nothing surprising about a biographer using another source in order to provide a more robust account of the person in question, even if they're an eyewitness. You can even see this in modern biographies. Assuming that Mark wrote his gospel first, all we can know for sure about Matthew from the fact that he copies Mark is that he viewed Mark as an authoritative and trustworthy source. And anyone that's trying to say that the Gospels are anonymous is going to struggle to see why Matthew would think that. Only if traditional authorship is correct, Mark is based on the remembrances of Peter, and of course, Matthew would view Peter's testimony as trustworthy and authoritative. But if Mark is just a random document circulating anonymously, it would seem odd that anyone would view it as authoritative enough to include it within a biography. So I actually want to argue that the synoptic problem is a bigger issue for those that want to say the Gospels are anonymous. Why on earth would Matthew copy Mark if it was just some random anonymous document? Traditional authorship can also fairly easily make sense of why Luke would use Matthew or Mark as a source, because in the same way, he would have viewed Matthew and Peter as authoritative and trustworthy sources for the life and ministry of Jesus. I have one more argument for the anonymous gospel hypothesis for you today, but let's recap so far. We have 2 fallacious arguments from silence, and then we have the synoptic problem, which actually upon analysis fares better for the traditional authorship view. Surely this last argument will fare better, right? Our last argument is going to be that the Gospels are written in high-quality Greek, and the disciples were uneducated, illiterate Aramaic speakers. First of all, we have to mention that the skeptic here is simply assuming that Jesus and his followers didn't speak Greek for this objection. There's been significant work done in recent years arguing that it's very possible that Jesus often taught in Greek as well as Aramaic. If this is the case, there is simply no reason to assume that his own followers were unable to speak Greek at all. The skeptic in this case is just begging the question without evidence. But let's assume for the sake of argument that they're right. Let's say Jesus and his followers only spoke Aramaic. Does this prove that the Gospels were anonymous? No. At best, it would only serve as evidence that possibly traditional authorship isn't correct. It wouldn't show that the Gospels were in fact circulating anonymously. Additionally, it still doesn't completely rule out traditional authorship. There is no reason to think that Mark or Luke, 2 Gentiles, couldn't speak Greek. Especially Luke, who, according to tradition, is a doctor who would have been educated. Matthew was a tax collector and would have had to know some Greek to write receipts. And John could have learned Greek at a later date in order to spread the gospel. There is no reason to say this isn't possible. Finally, they also could have used scribes when writing their gospels. There is nothing implausible about this either. The gospels being written in Greek is not a threat to traditional authorship. So hopefully now we can see that none of the arguments in favor of the anonymous gospel hypothesis work. And in a future video, I'm going to give you a positive case for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Thank you so much for watching this video. Give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel if you're new and you want more content like this. This has been The Epitome. I'm your host, Nathan Bozeman. We'll see you around.